Unfortunately, in our culture, there is a tendency to victim blame or cause secondary victimization to victims of certain crimes. So, to show a lessened sense of compassion, lessened access to justice, maybe less proper prosecution because of the type of crime the victim has been subjected to. So, for example, if someone is carjacked, we don't say to them, well, that's what you get for having a running vehicle. But a domestic violence victim, we may say, they shouldn't have gone back, or they knew that person had a history of violence. It's kind of their own fault. And just like with a home burglary, we wouldn't say to the victim, that's what you get for living in a residence. That's just part of the deal. Maybe you should have had more deadbolts. But a sexual assault victim, there is a tendency to blame the victim and say, well, you shouldn't have been wearing that, or you shouldn't have been in that location, or you consumed alcohol, so it's your own fault. And that type of secondary victimization that a victim experiences after going through the initial trauma, but then receiving less support from community, and re-victimization through the system that's also blaming the victim or showing a less drive to bring them justice, is really problematic. When you look at trafficking victims, 90% or more are charged with crimes. So even though they're in a forced situation, they're often charged with prostitution. They may be charged with weapon possession because they're trying to protect themselves. They could be charged with drug possession. And often many of the things they're doing are by force. They're trying to stay alive, yet they're penalized for being a victim. And this is a sad state of affairs when it comes to our system. And those of us who have done advocacy work with those types of victims know that our primary goal has been to push for proper justice, to make sure the victim is looped in and notified when the offender is arrested and released and is having a bail hearing or an arraignment, so the victim can properly attend. The victim's looped in just like any other crime victim. And one of the things that I really encouraged victims that I worked with to do would be to write a victim impact statement. And this is their opportunity to address the court, to address those in the room, including the offender, and share just how deeply they were impacted by the crime, whether it be assault or, whatever the stalking crime or sexual assault crime would have been, for them to fully express the deep impact on their loved ones, on them personally, on their finances, so that the court could really understand this is a person. This isn't a case number. This isn't just your typical average victim. This is an individual person that has the right to justice just like any other crime victim. And I would often go ahead of time with that victim, and we'd walk through the courtroom, and I'd try to familiarize them so they know what to expect and where they'd be sitting, and have them practice their statement just to kind of help make it easier, because on the day of sentencing or at that parole hearing in which they had opportunity to speak, many would become overwhelmed with emotion, and often the perpetrator had silent cues of intimidation that they would send toward the victim, whether it be looks or things like that, gestures and body movement. And so the victim would be very fearful and just emotional and not able to speak and read their statement. So I had the honor in several situations of being asked to read those statements for the victim and address the court. And what an honor it was to be the voice for those that at that moment were voiceless, that didn't feel like they had it within them to speak and advocate for themselves, and to really express to the court the true and detrimental impact that this victim experienced. Crime victims suffer regardless of what crime they're subjected to. And as a society, that's something we really should be looking at, especially if there's victim blaming as a result of those that perceive or assume that the victim has committed some type of sin, that, oh, they were sinning, so it's okay that they were victimized. This is justified. And in inheritance theft situations, many of those who were excluded or stolen from, the beneficiaries that were wrongfully excluded, they were victimized in a similar way, where it was justified by those who took from them by manufacturing false narratives. And these false narratives were intended for the purpose of discrediting the victim, damaging their reputation, slandering them. They would attack them in terms of their mental health and make claims that, this beneficiary isn't stable, or they can't handle their own money, they're not independent, therefore it's justified for us to take it. Or they may even go so far as to try to get the victim investigated, falsely accusing them of crimes so that they can become imprisoned and have charges so that they're ineligible for their portion of their inheritance. And these schemes can be quite diabolical, especially since they're often coming from family and community. And it comes down to selfishness, not wanting that victim of the smear campaign or the attacks behind the scenes to have what is rightfully theirs, or because they want it for themselves. And it's often masked as the concerned family. We're doing this out of love and concern because we want what's best for this money, therefore it shouldn't go to this person, it should go to us because we're concerned about the beneficiary. When meanwhile they're behind the scenes bullying and organized bullying and attacking the victim, and they'll be doing things like trying to get them kicked out of their home and then claim, see, they're unstable, or try to get them fired from their job. See, they're just not stable, we should take this money. And again, it's this victimization, this victim blaming and secondary victimization culture where it's justified in some people's minds that, it's okay to commit crimes. It's okay to steal from them or wrongfully imprison them or have them falsely investigated or falsely labeled with mental health conditions because we're justified in doing this. And I would just encourage us to think about that as a culture, how we treat victims of all kinds. And if you have knowledge of a scheme, a dark plot against someone to do this to them, whether you're implicit or complicit, you're swimming with the sharks because you have knowledge of what was occurring. And that knot in your stomach, the fear, that feeling of looking over your shoulder, the inability to sleep, feeling guilt and shame, those emotions aren't going to go away until you do right by that victim, until you come forward and speak the truth and choose to not swim with the sharks that are headed for the trap they've set, but choose to swim the other way and to do right and to stand up for justice, push for those who have done wrong and are proven to be a danger to society, that they're willing to go that far to harm someone, even their own loved one. Who knows what they would do to others if they would do that to their own loved one? It makes it really unsafe for everyone else, especially when they would go to such great lengths and were unwilling to stop until forced to stop. So, something to reflect on.